Way back before the pandemic began, I had a question. What does it take for a city person to go country? In 2015, I set out to explore through photography, writing, and now this podcast. In February, I recorded most of the interviews for the first season. I had planned to launch in April of 2020, the 5-year anniversary of the project. But then everything turned upside down, and it just didn't feel like the right time to launch because so much had changed overnight. As the initial shock of the pandemic wore off, it became clear that many people with the means to do so were leaving cities in droves. Recent data has shown that nearly 16 million people have relocated in the U.S. this year, making the concept of an urban exodus even more relevant. So while some of the interviews in this season were conducted before the pandemic, the topics they discuss, the questions they raise, and the answers they provide are more urgent than ever. I'm Melissa Hessler. Welcome to the Urban Exodus. Richard Blanco's poem One Today inspired the nation at Obama's 2013 inauguration. Richard is unsure if he would have been able to write the poem had he not been confined to his writing desk, surrounded by pine forest piled high with snow, in the ski town of Bethel, Maine. He even practiced his poem to a snowman audience in his yard several weeks before he made the journey to D.C. Richard has always been in search of home. The pursuit of home and what it takes to make a place feel like home are reoccurring themes in his writing. In today's episode, we talk about the inspiration rural life has provided for him and the joys and sacrifices that come with building a career outside the city. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your life was like growing up in Miami?
Well, I grew up in Miami since I was about 4 years old. I grew up in a very tight-knit Cuban exile community, so it was kind of a cultural bubble. But it was a very wonderful place to grow up in the sense of having a really great sense of community and support culturally, and just sort of a very strong sense of identity, which is still with me to this day.
What was your relationship like with poetry when you were younger?
I had no relationship with poetry. Basically, as a working class family, my parents, we didn't have books in the house. What few books we did have were on how to learn English, which were my parents' books. So I really didn't have much access to poetry or the arts in general. It was really something I discovered or started discovering or wanting to or yearning for much later in life, actually. Because I was a big snoop as a child, I always used to snoop through my older brother's textbooks to see if I'd find some juicy information about what girl he was dating or whatnot. And it was that book that I think it's still around, 101 Famous Poems, which was basically 101 famous poems by dead British white guys. But I remember reading lines composed about Tintern Abbey, just feeling the sense of longing for place and nostalgia and whatnot. And I remember crying because I remember feeling that was kind of like the way my parents felt about Cuba. It was my first moment to see here, here's this British, Wordsworth talking about Tintern Abbey. I didn't even know what an abbey was, but I remember the feeling. It was like listening to a song that you kind of understood emotionally, even though you didn't understand the letter of the word. I didn't start writing till I was 25. And then I was like, whoa, wait a minute. There's people writing today? I eventually got an MFA in creative writing and poetry, took a hiatus from my engineering career, and took a professorship at Central Connecticut State.
What do you love most about your home, your land, and this place where you've settled in Maine?
My writing has always been about searching for home, about searching for place, identity, community, belonging. And so nature in a way is like this. This is like the universal home. It's something that we all can belong to. And there's an incredible power in that, a certain sense of being and a certain connection that makes you feel at home, but also community. I mean, getting back to growing up in Miami is certainly a big city, but I also grew up in sort of a microcosm of that city, which is a very strong, like I had mentioned, very strong Cuban community. I was raised by a village. I mean, it wasn't just my house. It was like the grocer in the corner and the gas station attendant. We all, everybody knew each other. Everybody was sort of in the same space about being exiles and thinking about what was going to happen with Cuba. So I kind of always craved throughout my life that sense of community. And I find that here in a small town, going to the post office, sometimes a half hour adventure because you stop and start talking and gossiping, and all the rest. And so I've always craved that sense of community. And it's harder to find. It's harder to find in Miami now because it's gotten so big. It's kind of harder to find more and more in the modern world. I mean, it's just people are just always running around and busy and working and getting things done, and sort of you don't really run into that very often. One of the things I remember that was really interesting that maybe I didn't expect is that when we moved here, everybody knew who we already were. Yeah, you're the two gay guys from Miami. Everybody knew. You can't be very anonymous in a small town. So that was interesting. It was like, as I always tell people, like my partner and I are more out in Maine, in Bethel, Maine, than we are in New York City because, well, everybody, you cannot not be out in Bethel, Maine, because everybody knows who you are. And so that's kind of endearing, and then sometimes not. What was interesting about Bethel itself was that I thought I was, going to be really exotic, the Cuban gay man. And people don't really, it's like that New England thing. It's like they don't care what you are, they just care who you are as a human being and what kind of person you are, right? And I think that trumps a lot of things because, again, in a small community, it really comes down to that because we're all sort of, it's a much more even playing field because in a way you get 14 feet of snow on a Tuesday, you all have to pull together. It doesn't matter what you are or where you came from. We're all dealing with connecting to each other and being a town.
So in your work, you've always been searching for this idea of home. Do you feel like you are home now where you live?
Home is it's like asking what is love, right? It's a very big word. And it always changes. It changes as you change. It changes as conditions around you change. So even in my small town, in the past 7 years, I've been traveling 70% of my life is spent on a plane. It's starting to feel more of just taking on a different dimension. I'm enjoying it in a different way, almost like a second home, even though it's the only home I have. I'm on the road so much when I come home. Yeah, it's starting to take another dimension that's more about almost like getting away. Every time I come back home, I feel like I'm getting away from the world all over again. It's taken on more of an oasis kind of feeling. So even that's evolved, even that changes.
Do you envision Maine being a forever home for you?
Yeah, certainly. And I think I have fantasies of turning, sort of maybe endowing the house, if I can ever afford that, Gould Academy in town and making it kind of art or writer's center. That's something that's been on my periphery, just to have, even beyond my death, to have sort of a space here. So many important things happened here. Such a huge life change from becoming president to inaugural poet. And all that is in the DNA of this town and this house and Maine.
Has your demeanor or your value system changed at all since moving away from the city?
No, I mean, I think it reinforced my belief in community and how important that is and human connection. On the other hand, it's also made me a lot more impatient with rudeness and with people that are just not paying attention, lines. So I tend to be a little bit of a grouch sometimes when there's too many people around.
Living in a rural area has real challenges when it comes to making a living. What sacrifices have you and your partner had to make in order to be able to create this oasis in Maine?
One is having to live 90 minutes from an airport. But on the other hand, when I lived part-time in Boston, I would still go to the airport 3 hours before because you never know what traffic you're going to get. So here I just go 2 hours before and I can still make my flight without a problem. It's a smaller airport in Portland. But, that kind of distance to get to certain things like doctors or hospitals or sometimes just to get to a Home Depot. I mean, Home Depot the nearest Home Depot is 45 minutes away. It's a beautiful drive, but it's still 45 minutes. So I think also in terms of sacrifices, people don't visit us as much. In the first few years, everybody's like, yay, yeah, let's go see Maine. And then I guess the novelty wears off for people. So getting family and friends to come visit has become more difficult in the sense of, for the same reasons, getting them up here and whatnot. And of course, they love the place and they adore it. But I think people would visit, we would have more connections. We lived in a big city. We would see people more often in that sense. Part of what I do miss sometimes, and maybe now more than at the beginning, we got to admit there's limited cultural resources or outlets, right? I mean, you can't just go to a play or go to, we have a movie theater that shut down. Finally, someone bought it and reopened it again. We got a bowling alley now. So sometimes I do miss being able to just, hop on a subway and go see, world-class art or an amazing play.
Do you envision more people returning to rural America in the coming years, or do you think there'll be a continuation of more and more people living in cities?
Well, I think economics has a lot to do with that. And so, like you said, I'm lucky because I can work out of the home and I don't have to have a job. But I mean, it's very challenging in rural communities because, I couldn't get a job in Maine unless certainly not writing poetry, not being a poet, right? So I think that might be a limiting factor, how much of that can happen. I think the trend lately has been also economics, but people are moving to smaller cities that have a sense of community and have more opportunity. And that I kind of see as more of a trend. Smaller cities in rural settings are certainly seem to be a trend for opportunity and also a slower paced kind of life that I think you have access to that rural sensibility and experience and authenticity while still being able to have a job and earn a living and have schools, etc.
Do you ever have to combat feelings of isolation in the country, or has living in a smaller community made you feel more connected to others?
It makes me feel more connected, but the tendency is, I tend to be somewhat of an introvert. You can just get so wrapped up in your own work at home, at least in my case, because I work at home. And sometimes I can spend 3 days without leaving the house. And I make myself go out somewhere to dinner to places where I know I'll know people because I'm like, this is getting weird. When you start talking to the dog and the dog starts answering you, you need to get out of the house. So there's that isolation. Everything in life, of course, is a balance, right? And sometimes I just I've been alone for 3.5 days. I need to at least go to the grocery store, go see somebody, say hello. And it feels like, oh my God, there's humans on the earth. I forgot. So you can make yourself feel very isolated. And I think you just have to break that. It's much easier to be isolated than it is, obviously, in big cities or any kind of city. So it's a great thing. But yeah, we always try to remember to not fall into that for too long.
There are many great writers and poets that have come from Maine. Why do you think this area calls? What is it about living in this state that helps influence great works?
I think every writer can be a little bit different, or you go through different phases of your life where you need different things. Just yesterday, I got back from a trip and the wind was blowing. It was really cold. And the snow is flying all over the place. And I'm sitting in the porch, just watching all this. There's a certain sense of just peacefulness. I mean, even though it's minus 38,000 degrees. It's just a sense of, I think it's getting back to the nature. Nature reminds us of our fragility, our connection to something larger, changes our brainwaves, and to be ever present in everywhere in Maine. I mean, just taking a drive to, Portland or taking a drive to, anywhere. You're always surrounded by nature, lakes, more pine trees than people. It's a certain surrender that happens, and in that surrender comes serenity and a space that opens up where I think art and writing comes from. Maine is like one big Walden pond. Also, just again, because it's a quiet rural town, you don't have as many stressors. So you actually kind of work more in a weird way, but you can also get more exhausted because there's nothing, you don't have to 45 or an hour and a half commute every day. You're not dealing with traffic. You're not dealing with crowds. I've just found that it's much easier to get into the writing space in that sense and allowing me not necessarily more time to write because we always get busy with everything, but certainly easier to get into that creative space.
Do you attribute any of your success as a poet to moving away from the city?
Not necessarily moving away from the city, but I think moving a lot. I think it's just a variety of experiences. And I want to include in that also travel, because I think that's also something that, for me in particular, a sense of home is and place and identity and how these things happen to us or how we make them happen to me really comes a lot also when I travel. That constantly keeps the question of home fresh in my mind. And in that way, it's given me different ways to talk about my obsession with home that hopefully doesn't sound like the same home for 15 years, but all these kinds of things. I think that in general keeps me alive.
Do you have any advice for people who would like to build their career, but they're based in the city and they really want to move rurally?
And you really got to take inventory and say, is this really something I want to do? And if so, realize you got to plan for it. First of all, you got to earn your place there to be able to bargain for what you want. Establish yourself, I guess is what I want to say, knowing that your long-term plan is maybe to have this opportunity and then present it. What's the worst that they can do? Say no, right? So I think that's becoming more and more valid. I worked up here when I first moved to Maine. I worked for a year and a half remotely with my engineering office in Miami. But I had earned that right. I had earned that bargaining power. And I probably would still be doing it if it wasn't that Obama called and asked me to write a poem for the country. I probably still would be able to do that. So I think, strategize is what I would say, and not just think, oh, it wouldn't be nice if someday, and not just say that to preempt it too much, and realize it does take planning and it does take picking even a place of a kind. That takes a lot of thinking and planning and soul searching.
This episode is brought to you by Hessler Creative Workshops, a creative duo, spoiler alert, it's my husband and I, offering both visual and destination photography workshops. Join us in our Creative Connection course running January 8th through 9th. Creative Connection meets once a week for group critiques paired with lectures and assignments designed to inspire, experiment, and expand your artist's eye. Learn more and see our full list of virtual and destination workshops at hesslercreative.com. You were previously a civil engineer. Do you have any thoughts around the ways cities and small towns are structured?
That's a really interesting, great question, because it's something that I also have worked in and studied as an engineer, a civil engineer, and worked on a lot of town revitalization projects, town economic development projects, sort of remaking towns and rethinking about how towns work. One of the reasons I love New York City, in smaller doses, but I still love New York City, is that you're really living in a village, right? And every single 2 or 3 square blocks is a whole community in of itself. And so you do know the baker, and you do know the server in the corner in your neighborhood restaurant, and the bartender, and you do know the person at the dry cleaner, and you do stop and have conversations. So I think what we've tried to do is thinking about localizing things so that people have community right where they are and don't feel like they have to go drive 4 miles or 10 miles to have a nice dinner out. So thinking about how we build community by restructuring how the city is organized or the town is organized. And even in Miami, which is where I did most of my work, is how do you build nodes or nodules of community where people can live, work, and play and feel a lot closer, plus cutting down on commute time, less stress, more time to spend with family and friends. So I think there's the old outdated model of, the suburban model of here's where all the businesses are and here's where all the people live and here's where all the warehouses are, instead of a mixed use so that people can actually create communities, walking communities. And I think we all crave that, because I think at the end of the day, no matter where you live, you're always, in a sense, craving community. Cities are just trying to how to make that easier and make that more accessible to people.
When we last met, you spoke of cities as a human landscapes with their infrastructures living and moving like an organism of sorts. What was it like adapting to a largely non-human landscape? Are there things that you've learned from the way the natural world operates?
This is something I've always, in a way, been thinking about, whether that be the sea, the ocean, or mountains, or my pine trees here. There's a great model that I've started to write about. I think it's a poem called Some Days at Sea that sort of speaks to that. What I've seen nature and having access to that kind of constantly is that nature offers us a great sort of model or kind of a metaphor about human nature. Every time I look out my window, it's a completely different landscape, right? Something about it is different. The snow's different. The trees bending are a different way. A new weed came up. And yet it's still itself. And so how do we as human beings always live knowing, centered in who we are, but always different too?
It feels like America is getting more and more polarized. What do you think can be done to help lessen this and move towards a more cooperative and peaceful society?
It's a big question. It's something that I'm sort of working on now in terms of my new poetry. I'm thinking about exactly that. I try to do it through my poetry and trying to create work that is not beating the same old drum, that's not just preaching to the choir, but hopefully opens up some kind of new conversation and new perspectives and notions that we have all sort of entrenched ourselves in and stop being in an echo chamber. And I think, through the interview, you're making me think about how this great documentary about the border. It sort of traced the whole border, went towns and through cities and whatnot, and interviewing people and just thinking about the perspectives. There's nothing truer than experiencing people and experiencing places, because everything else is sort of an abstraction abstracted by media, abstracted by even popular culture, abstracted by stereotypes that we just have grow up with. So, if people, it's a big country, but if people were just sort of see each other more as people and get to have those experiences, once there's more of a real human connection, and that's what I try to do with my poetry, is I have maybe people meet on the page, or hopefully have them be inspired to experience something different than what they're used to through an experience that I've had and sharing that. But it's a tough time right now, because I think we're so convinced of who we are, right? Or who other people are. And it's become, we can discount entire cities, entire states, entire regions through stereotypes, right? Or what color they are in a map, and there's really all kinds of people living in places of all kinds of political persuasions, of all kinds of everything, right? And so it's a big country. So
how do you envision poetry evolving to meet the demands of our changing society?
Poetry has always had a component of it that has been about oral tradition and about community and about a collective sense of people. That's dwindled over the years, obviously. Well, it's dwindled since the invention of the printing press and TV. Also, music has replaced a lot of that need of just to have poetry in our lives. But I've seen it step up a lot. The younger generation are understanding how poetry, more of the civic role of poetry and poets is, and thinking about how poems can speak to something larger than just the self, although that's always also very valid and very powerful. But that, as I say, starting to understand the poetry of we versus just the poetry of I, or rather the poetry of us. And so I've seen a lot of that. Different times demand a different kind of poetry, and it's kind of part of the evolution of the art form, is that we've done the sort of very introspective, very autobiographical poetry for a while, and again, very powerful and stuff that can still teach us amazing lessons, but we're sort of evolving into another layer of that, getting back to the idea of community, understanding community in the context of poetry. And that's been wonderful to see. As I was saying, in my childhood, I had no access, and I had this archaic sense of what poetry was till I started writing at 25, 26. So the good part of that is that I get to be that person that hopefully opens their eyes, as other poets have done for me, and say, look, no, all poets aren't dead. Like, we're writing about stuff that matters right now. We're writing about social political issues. We're writing about climate change. We're writing about all these other kinds of things. And I get to be the person that sort of opens their eyes and gets them to crack the door open to poetry. And it's, for me in particular, because my role is so public as inaugural poet, that, I get to do readings in most unlikely places, at the FDA, it's at one of the strangest ones was the FDIC. And so for many of these people, it's the first time they've ever even been to a poetry reading, and they're petrified. So I get to be that person.
This season of the Urban Exodus podcast is brought to you by Jake.art. Bring the beauty of the outdoors in. Search their collection of affordable, high-quality fine art prints by color or theme to find just the right work for your home or office. Whether you need a visual escape into the beauty of the natural world while stuck indoors, or want to send a thoughtful gift over the holidays, Jake.art, that's JAKE.ART, has you covered. Enter the code URBANEXODUS, all one word, at checkout for 15% off your order now through January 1st.
When you walk into a classroom, do you come in with certain ideas or thoughts that you wish to impart on your students? And if so, what are they?
If it's just sort of more of a literature class, it's just, again, getting them to expose them and getting over their fear of poetry and trying to introduce really contemporary voices to them. So, I try to always bring in regional poets and let them see that there's poets living amongst them that are writing stuff about their very towns, states, regions. So that's one thing I try to do. With creative writing classes, really, besides just teaching the basic elements of craft and techniques of writing poetry, I guess my greatest challenge, really, I think, just really trying to deepen their connection to their own work and trying to understand that this isn't just about writing a poem, but that it's in a way a spiritual process, right? That it's something that's about connecting to something deeper in yourself that you didn't know was there, an idea or an emotion or an experience that you didn't know what it meant. And so to get them to dive deeper, I think is always sort of the subtext of my teaching, is to really get them in touch with that subconscious part of the self, which is what ultimately I think when you can tap into that and you find conscious language for that subconscious sea of memories and experiences and thoughts that are with us sort of or flowing underneath our conscious mind, that sometimes that's when the best poetry arises. And that's hard sometimes too, because people sometimes don't want to go there, or, they're just consumed in the technique or the technical part of writing and not understanding that it's also a very mysterious process, that it's a leap of faith. It's trusting your instincts and trusting your experiences in life to speak.
What are some new ideas you are currently exploring in your work, and what are some projects that you are working on and have worked on since we visited you? Gosh, when did we visit you? In 2015?
Well, we did a beautiful book called Boundaries with photographer Jacob Hessler, and it was 12 poems or photographs on the theme of boundaries of all kinds, not just physical boundaries, but psychological ones, boundaries of race, boundaries of gender, etc. And that book, which is just a beautiful book, sort of limited edition, fine press book, spawned a larger book, which I finished last year. It's called How to Love a Country. Poetry has changed. It's changed for me too. I never thought I'd write a book that was so public or that had so much of the we and the us in it as I have lately. And right now I'm exploring a few things. One is I'm exploring performance a little bit more, how a poem becomes different when it becomes now drama, right? So I'm interested in exploring that either by doing it myself or combining it with maybe writing more for stage. And so I've been working with Portland Stage for a while. It's very challenging, it's like trying to learn a whole new genre for me, but I've always loved theater.
I first spoke with Richard back in February of 2020. A lot has changed since then. He sent me this audio postcard update last week.
So I'm taking a walk along what we call the Summer Road on the property, which is just an old road from God knows how many years ago. that's not used anymore. And it kind of loops around the edge of our hill. And it's a nice breeze flowing through here today. Well, a lot sure has happened since February. See, I had taken a job at my alma mater in Miami, and my plan was to sort of live on both ends of I-95, get those wonderful winters in Miami and the wonderful summers up here in Maine. But of course, all that's kind of up in the air now. As soon as classes went remote, I had to drive 3 days back up to Maine. I felt safer up here at my home in Bethel. And this is where I've been and teaching remotely. I am glad to be up here. It feels like a very safe place to be during the pandemic. And I need to go out like once or twice a week for groceries or whatnot. And seems very quiet here compared to a lot of the chaos that's going on in the world. So I'm glad for that. Still, that being said, what active social life we did have, of course, has come to a standstill. So it does feel a little bit lonelier. It was always good to at least gather with friends once a week or once every couple of weeks at our favorite restaurant or two and connect socially. So I'm also realizing that isolation, as much as I love being isolated as a writer up in the woods, that we are, at the end of the day, are social animals and need social interaction, however little that may be, but we need some of it. So I am missing that. But again, I'm glad to be up in Maine for this time, thinking about how I can incorporate this new experience as I move forward in managing, trying to live, taking advantage of all we've learned with respect to connecting to the outside world without necessarily having to be in person. The other thing that's funny is, of course, my husband is here also and has no schedule either. So it's been kind of fun to have date nights and whatnot and sort of make our own fun. We're thinking of having our own New Year's party and theming it and, getting decorations, and why not, even though it's just us two. But all in all, I got to be grateful. We are weathering things, and at the same time, so looking forward to when our lives begin to even look normal again.
Thank you for joining me for my conversation with Richard Blanco. I just love the way that Richard talks about creativity, about community, and about the power of poetry to heal and to start important dialogues on the issues that we are facing in our society today. To read more about Richard and see photos from his original Urban Exodus feature, visit our website. Visit Richard's website, Richard-Blanco, for videos, books, and more. You can sign up to get on the wait list for Richard Blanco's virtual weekend poetry intensive this winter by visiting How Hill Farm, that's HOWE, hillfarm.com. Join me next time when I speak with James Ray of Little Seed Farm. James and his wife Eileen left New York City to start a goat farm in Tennessee. James kept his city position and telecommuted so that they could afford the startup costs to get their farm up and running. But just a few months after they moved, the company James worked for went under, and he was out of a job. With Eileen pregnant, they had to get to work quickly to focus their efforts and find a way to earn a living. They never could have imagined that in just a few short years, they would build a nationally recognized farm-based skincare company from their rural locale. It is a really inspiring conversation, and I hope you'll join us. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at The Urban Exodus. To read more in-depth features on folks who ditched the city and went country, visit our website, urbanexodus.com. Urban Exodus is an enormous labor of love. If you appreciate the content we create, please consider supporting our efforts on Patreon. If you are a small business who would like to sponsor an episode, please visit the podcast page on our website to learn more. An enormous thank you to my team who made this podcast possible. Production by Simone Leon, editing by Ari Snyder, and music by Benjamin Bethurum. I'm Alyssa Hessler, and this is The Urban Exodus. Stay kind, stay joyful, stay resilient.